All right, everybody, let's get started. Welcome, folks. It's time for the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Great to be with you again for another edition of our program. My name is Chris Smith. I'm coordinator for current science programs here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And at this lecture series on Wednesdays at 12 o'clock, we gather around the glow of our YouTube screens, or maybe you've grabbed a chair or a seat inside the SECU Daily Planet Theater, inside the museum's Nature Research Center, to learn something new, hear from interesting people, and see what's going on out there in the worlds of science and nature. And today we're going to do just that. Now, thanks for tuning in, of course. I'll let you all know that for today's program, we're totally virtual, but that doesn't mean that you can't participate. If you have questions that you want to ask and you're watching on YouTube, you can jump into the chat and let us know. Just type them into the chat box as we go throughout the presentation. When we get to the end of the talk, we have a long segment set up for audience Q&A so we can have a great conversation. As long as everything is queued up there in the chat, I've got your questions ready. I'll share them with today's guest speaker and we can have a nice conversation. If you've grabbed a seat inside the Daily Planet Theater, I believe there's actually some government employees over there with the Office of Environmental Education. Just go elbow them and tell them you've got a question you want to ask and they can type it into the chat. If you're not logged into your YouTube account, of course, you can also use other social media. Just use the hashtag lunchtime discovery. That way we'll see it and we can get your questions shared into the program as we have time. So I'm excited to see so many people joining in, saying hello in the chat. Of course, you can always just jump in the chat and drop a little waving hand emoji or something to say hi, hello, and let us know that you're there tuning into today's program. I almost said that for today's program, you could just like tweet your questions at us, but that might get a little confusing with today's topic since we're talking about birds. That's a terrible joke. Today's guest on the program is the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences Curator for Ornithology, John Gerwin. And John joins me now. Hi, John.
Hey, Chris, how are you? How's everybody?
I'm
Ready to?
doing all right, thanks. Hope that you've got some energy ready for today's talk.
All right, here we go then. I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen as always. You got us onto the main screen. Here we go. Well, welcome everybody. And today is on a day that's kind of a dreary, drizzly, little cooler day. Definitely a November day, and it's to me it's sparrow weather. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about sparrows, just North Carolina sparrows, some of the identification tips and some natural history, and let's get into it. I'd like to give a big thanks to folks who've been helping me out over the years. I've been involved in some work with sparrows, but I'm also involved with just collating information. I've been doing work to catch and tag birds, and I have a large banding crew that helps me out in a couple places in the Piedmont. And I'm going to be pulling information together from folks like Brian O'Shea at the museum and NC State, UNC, Wilmington students. My colleagues at the Wildlife Resources Commission have been a big help with my site in the URs, and I'll be showing some maps from what Harry LeGrand has pulled together for the birds in North Carolina. So the sparrows they intimidate a lot of people. And I make the joke that there are 50 shades of reddish-brown. As you can see on these birds, there is a lot of that reddish-brown, although that's a color that it can mean something to some people, but it can also mean so many things. So we're going to look into some of the subtleties of the sparrows. It's a pretty big group, and really it's too big to deal with. So I'll cover some of the different aspects of ID tips, some natural history of the birds in North Carolina. I'll cover some more in depth than others, some of the natural history, and I wanted to report on some studies that have been done. These folks have been doing some of the work more recently. So folks at UNC Wilmington have been looking at marsh sparrows, and NC State, they looked at Bachman's and Henslow sparrows, and I'll report on that. As a group, the sparrows are in that where the top arrow is, the passerellity is the family, and you can see there's 129 sparrows in the world. For comparison, if you know your birds, you might recognize wood warblers. There's 110. Everybody knows the cardinals and grosbeaks. There's 47, and if you know tanagers, there's a lot in the tropics of 371 species. So the sparrows are still a pretty sizable group. They include things that we don't call sparrows. Towhees, for example, and junco, they are genetically closely related. So they're in this, what we call the family tree of sparrows. I'm not going to be covering those. I'm just going to stick to the ones that you're mostly know as a sparrow, like a song sparrow and a white-throated sparrow. Some sparrows that we call, things that we call sparrows are really not a sparrow in that sense, that genetic sense. For example, the house sparrow is in the weaver finch family of Plosiidae. But that's how common names are. So, that's, we're all familiar with that. In North Carolina, these are the 21 species that I've compiled from different sources. There may have been another one that's shown up in the years, but I can't, can't go into detail on all of these. So, a number of these are pretty rare. Actually, there's 6 or 7 that are not very common. So, I'm not going to go into that. You can go on the Birds of North Carolina and see photos of things like a tree sparrow or Harris's sparrow that have only been seen less than, Harris's sparrow, there are only 10 records in the state in 100 years. So we'll focus on some of the other things, and then also, as you'll hopefully as you'll see, um, people do get nervous looking at sparrows or talking about sparrows, but we'll show that maybe it's not so difficult. One thing to point out is that if you're able to get a look at the head of a sparrow, of those sparrows in North Carolina, I'm pretty confident that you could identify all of them if all you saw was the head. So there on the upper left is a illustration from Sibley's Field Guide on a topography of a large sparrow head, and that's pretty dramatic. But even though the one on the lower right isn't as dramatic, it's actually diagnostic. That flesh-colored bill, that eye ring, and that head pattern, there's nothing else like it. And we're going to go over that. So I just want to point out that um, if you only saw the head of the sparrows around here, you'd be able to figure out what they are. I'm going to go through a few that are less common and then jump into things that are more common and a few of the things that have been studied. The Vesper sparrows, they're around. They have this eye ring is pretty notable. There's only a couple of sparrows that have the eye ring. The one I showed you before was a field sparrow. We'll talk about that in a minute. The little streaking on the upper breast with the eye ring together, you won't see anything else like it. And this one is one of the 2 sparrows that has some white in the outer tail feather. You don't always see that, but here's a case underneath where you can see it pretty well in this photograph. This color on the breast is pretty diagnostic too. There's just nothing else like it in the sparrow world. This is the bird of the pretty semi-barren open ground, short grass or areas that don't even have vegetation, just sand or gravel and rock outcroppings. Here's another couple of viewpoints. And where it's, whoops, I'll just mention that there's a few of them that breed in the northwestern part of North Carolina, so in Ashe and Allegheny and Watauga counties, for example. Otherwise, it's more of a winter inhabiting or a winter bird across North Carolina. I'm going to jump to another one this is a really uncommon one in North Carolina. It has an interesting story, and this is the lark sparrow. So you saw the drawing in the early slide. That head pattern is pretty diagnostic. Here's a good couple of good photos. The one on the right that Jeff Bean got in the sandhills. You can see he's got the sunlight hitting it, and shows that really chestnut patch to the side of the head. So these are adults, and it's a pretty dramatic bird. So what's interesting about this bird is that somewhere in the history of North Carolina, this is a bird of the Midwest, upper Midwest, U.S. and Southwest. This is not a bird of the East. But yet somehow a few birds showed up in North Carolina, and they took up residence in the sandhills, so on the game lands, on Camp Mackerel, on Fort Bragg, and they stayed and they breathed. I don't know, there can't be 2 or 3 dozen pairs across the whole region, but there they are, and that's the only place. But you can see some in migration in other places, but nobody knows why they showed up there, but they did, and they stayed. And here's a pair that Jeff photographed because he found the nest back in 2017. It's one of the few nests that were found for North Carolina, but here they are then. So in the upper left, this is the range-wide map. You can see what I mean about being a Midwestern bird and out to the Great Plains into the Rockies, and then it's really not an eastern bird. But here in North Carolina, they're spotted in different places in any given year. But the birds that breed are down here in the sandhills. And again, we don't know why they showed up there, but they did, and there they are. It's a beautiful song. If you get a chance to go online and listen to some of the songs of sparrows, I would recommend listening to a lark sparrow song. It's very cool. A white-crowned sparrow. This is a bird that does not breed in North Carolina, so it's here just in the fall and the winter. Pretty diagnostic. The head pattern there and that grayish color underneath. Let's look at a few other examples. It is pretty hard to confuse, and I know there's white-throated sparrow, which is over here on the right for comparison with the white throat. But even if you only saw the top of the head, notice the black comes across the top of the bill here on a white-crowned sparrow. It doesn't do that on white-throated. But the color on the back, this color back here, the gray and brown, it's really diagnostic. And even these spots on the wing, a lot of sparrows will have a wing bar, but a white-crowned sparrow, the bars are broken up. So there's little, almost like teardrops. I took the map out. We don't, they're found in a number of places around North Carolina, but they never seem to be in big numbers. Once in a while, we found a flock of about 40 out in the Orries one year, and then we never saw that again. That's been 9 years, but we usually see 4 or 5 birds out there, but we never see the 40 like before. People have their favorite spots where they go to find these birds in the winter, but they never seem to be common anywhere. So here is a picture showing two that look alike, but they're actually two species. And the one on the right is an immature white-crowned sparrow, just to show that it's very similar to this little field sparrow on the left, but by the head pattern, the flesh color on the stripes on the head. But the white-crowned sparrow is a much larger bird, like the white-throated sparrow, and the field sparrow is pretty dainty. You'd know the difference if you saw them alive, or even if you saw that white-crowned sparrow, you can tell that they're much bigger. And then this is another pattern showing the compared to a white-throated sparrow and the difference in the coloration. It's subtle. A lot of these sparrows have, it's a subtle, but it's a significant difference in, say, the way that the browns, the blacks, and the tans and reddish browns all come together, and how they show up, especially when the sunlight's hitting them. It's they are distinct. Actually, I did not take the map out here, the map. So this is a bird, like a lot of these that are uncommon. They're breeding way to the north. They're way up north in Canada. They migrate through in the fall, through Canada, the northern U.S., and then they come into the rest of the U.S. here in the winter. So North Carolina, you can see it's been found. These are where they're found in a lot of different counties. But again, I don't find them to be common anywhere in the state. So speaking of what is common, this is probably the most common sparrow around North Carolina. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it because it's also perhaps the most urban sparrow out there, the chipping sparrow. Very distinctive with its chestnut crown. The line over the eye here is generally pretty white. It's a grayish white, but in the right light white, and then a black line through the eye. Got a dark bill in the breeding season. It's a bicolored bill in the winter, non-breeding. And if the bird turns around and the wings spread out, you'll see this gray rump and a notched tail. So all these things line up, but that head is pretty diagnostic. You would not mistake this bird for anything else if all you saw was the head of that one. And again, it's an urban bird. They love to come to feeders. They also, I spread cracked corn on the ground out back, and there are forever a few chipping sparrows out there scratching around with the cracked corn or the oats that I throw out. They do molt in the fall, late summer, early fall, and when they do, they look a little different. So that can be a little confusing. So here again, the bill becomes two-tone. It's still got the line over the eye and the black line through the eye, and it's a clean breast pattern. The crown is now streaked. The immatures look like this too, so they all tend to look alike. And I think I wrote that down here, and I've already just told you everything. So they have a couple of small wing bars. But you will by behavior and by where you are say these are birds that you'll often see along your street. urban neighborhoods that hop along the sidewalks, and you can tell just by where you are that you're looking at a chipping sparrow. And again, it's all over. It's one of the most common, very urban. They build a nest with uh, vegetate grasses and then hair, animal hair. They love horsehair if they're around a pasture, and they love short grass. So they like a lawn too. So if your lawn, if you have a dog and you throw the hair out, or a cat, throw the hair out, or your hair, if you comb your hair and throw it out, these birds will incorporate that hair into their nest. So it's a very weak nest, but you can tell that doesn't matter. The bird's doing very well, but they often get blown out of the trees in a storm, and people find them on the ground. But when you find this weak looking or dainty nest, no sticks, and with all this animal hair inside, you pretty much have a chipping sparrow. Pine warblers do a little bit of that too, but mostly the chipping sparrow. So similar to a chipping sparrow, the field sparrow. They're also pretty common. They're not really in the field so much as in shrubby meadows and edges of woods. And we've seen this now a couple times, but again, it's that head pattern with the flesh-colored bill, the eye-ring, and the gray on the nape, the way the reddish-brown looks on its head, you would know it's kind of a long-tailed one, also notched, often like a chipping sparrow, and plain-breasted. So some of these sparrows you see are plain-breasted, some have got streaks, and I'll show a picture in a minute where some of the plain-breasted birds do have streaks on them when they're immatures, but that doesn't, or juveniles really, but that doesn't last very long. So just a close-up of the head again. If you saw that head and that's all you saw, you would know it's the field sparrow. All right, so we've gone over all those things. And again, I don't think I have a problem with this. So at Prairie Ridge, we do surveys. We've done bird banding, and Brian O'Shea has been doing dawn surveys out there for 15 years. And he's noted that it gets an influx in the fall. I'm gonna move my little thing out of the way. There we go. From mid-November to early December. So we get birds here all year round, but we get birds from the north who also come in. So some arrive in late August and September. Those may be wandering breeding birds from the Piedmont who wander over to certain areas, and then others come in from the north, say in mid-November to early December. A few of them used to breed at Prairie Ridge, but no more. The habitat has changed. It's grown up a bit, and so the birds have moved on. So I think of it again as a scrub species, not so much a field species. Oh, these you see them in the field, but they're often on the edges of woods where the fields meet the woods, and also where there's saplings and shrubbery in a meadow or in a field, not just grass. But it's pretty widespread bird. The numbers have been declining in parts of its range, presumably just because a lot of those meadows turn into subdivisions or manufacturing sites. So I mentioned that some of the birds that are plain-breasted are not plain-breasted at a certain point of their life, and these are juveniles. So when they come off the nest, this is a chipping sparrow on the left and a field sparrow on the right. When they leave the nest, this is what they look like for about a month. So they wear these clothes for about a month, so they're streaked. But this guy's still got that black line through the eye, and even though it's not white, it's dirty white over the eye. It's still got the chipping sparrow look. It will molt in after a month or so, and then it will look like one of the non-breeding plumage adults. And the field sparrow here, again, it's got that flesh-colored bill. It hasn't quite got the eye ring yet, but it's got certain coloration back here. It already looks like a field sparrow. It's already molting, but it's got the streaks here. It's starting to molt here, and in a couple of weeks, it will look like a field sparrow, more like a field sparrow. But you can expect to see some of these things that are pretty confusing. But here's a case where, again, you see a bird in the lawn in your front yard or your neighbor's lawn hopping around with streaks on it. It's a sparrow. It's going to be a chipping sparrow. So there's what the head of that chippy will look like in just a couple of weeks, and the field sparrow. So we'll move on into another bird where a few breed in the mountains, but mostly they show up in the winter, and that's the Savannah sparrow. It's got a somewhat short notch tail relative to its body. The area that we call the lores is right in here, sort of between the bill and the eye, right above. And they often have some yellow, not always, but often. The breast streaking, it's a bit more narrow than some of the other birds like song sparrow, which is looks similar to. And so these are just a little more clean cut. If you happen to see the crown stripe in the middle, it's white. That can be hard to see on the bird, but there it is. It's got a certain color to the back that to me is really recognizable. You know, once you learn it and see it, it's different from the others. And they often show this little mustachy sort of patterning here, like this one. It's got the mustache. Only a couple birds do that. This one and the song sparrow show that. So, again, this guy's got a little bit of yellow on him. They may or may not have a central spot on the breast, which is similar to a song sparrow, but the song sparrow's got a proportionally much longer tail and has this different color, reddish brown. We'll see song sparrow at the end. This is a bird of short grass, some meadows, also on bare ground. A lot of times when we see them, they're on very short grass or grass that's interspersed with bare ground, bare soil, and often in large flocks in the winter. And here's just a couple different vantage points. So here's a bird that's got the breast streak, got a little bit of yellow. Here's a bird that's got a little more yellow, and here's a bird on the right that has almost no yellow, and they're all Savannah sparrows. There's a lot of variation in Savannah sparrow. People have studied them for years. I don't know what the final answer is. They've been named as subspecies across their range. It's a broad range, and I think there were some 20 subspecies named. This is a bird I photographed out in North Dakota when I was out a couple years ago to see some sparrows in their breeding range. So here he is showing the yellow on it. And again, here's their range. So Savannah sparrows are much more broadly found across their breeding range, across Canada, northern US, down the Rockies, and all these different populations have been given their own name. And I'm not sure if anybody really knows, but again, the answer to all of that, but been some birds that are adapting to different habitats that they're in. We don't see them anymore at Prairie Ridge, but the habitat has changed, so we don't have that bare open ground so much anymore. We have tall grass and we have the shrubs and we have all the trees we planted now are growing up. So we have this little bit of forest out there. So the birds have said, well, we don't like that. So they moved on. And then here is the grasshopper sparrow. A notable thing, two notable things. This is a small bird. Sparrows in general are small, but some are really small, like this one. But yet the bill is proportionally big. So if this bird were to hop up on a fence line like this, they sometimes get on the fence post, and you saw just the silhouette of the head and the bill, you'd probably guess that it was a grasshopper. There's one other bird that looks like this that can be in similar habitat, but the Henslows we'll look at in a bit, but the breast is very different on that bird. So anyway, the back is a really dramatic pattern. I'm going to look up close, let you see this closer because this is a really beautiful, beautiful pattern of this black and chestnut. And you might think, well, there's all this black and chestnut, but again, when you start looking at these things up close, you find that the pattern is different. This bird is the black is on this interior half of the feather, whereas the tip is where the chestnut is, and on the other species, if they show this pattern at all, it's a different pattern. The black and the chestnut are in different parts of the feather, and it just really stands out. But this bird to me is pretty dramatic for a little bird. And that pattern not only is on the back, it goes all the way up the neck on these guys. So here's a couple adults that are food in their bill, probably the same bird that was feeding young down on Mid Pines Road. So they breed in the western part of the state on through the Piedmont, and then they generally stop about Wake County or Johnson County. They don't breed much further east of that, but they do occur in the non-breeding season. It's a very high-pitched insect-like song, which I can no longer hear. And then here's a young one. Again, they get a little bit of streaking in them when they're young. They won't hold that for too very long, a month, 6 weeks, and then they will become more plain-breasted like you see the adults here. So again, the mapping. So for North Carolina on the lower right, they've been found in, over half the counties. They're probably in these other counties just haven't been found. It can be a little bit tricky finding them. And then here is a map showing the breeding distribution. And like I was saying here, the line of breeding comes down through the eastern Piedmont, and then they generally don't breed much, east of this area here, Wake County, and that I-95, so to speak. They're down here every now and then. People report a few breeders, but it's pretty uncommon. It's mostly a non-breeding bird. They will breed in hayfields. And this, of course, has led to some conflict with harvesting. So, when we're interested in birds like this, these early succession birds that have taken a hit, because a lot of that early succession is great for making subdivisions and, manufacturing plants and stuff that when farmers have hayfields and they have birds we're interested in, if we want them to delay a harvest, we have to pay for it. So there is money in the farm bill for things like that. It's competitive and, it's a bit of paperwork, but we have done things like that for some of the birds that will breed in a hayfield and with a willing farmer. So on a shift down into the sandhills now, where we can find the Bachman sparrow, and there've been a couple of studies done. Chris Morman over at NC State and a couple of his students have looked at the breeding biology of the Bachmans. They're found in the longleaf pine ecosystem. I think everybody are very familiar with that, especially with red-cockaded woodpecker. So it's a fire-dependent system. The wiregrass, longleaf pine, in the sandhills on Fort Bragg, a few other places. Folks with the Wildlife Resources Commission did some survey work to figure out where the birds are and also where they are not, because the habitat or the distribution has changed over the years. And so here's the range map of the Bachman sparrow, and what the hash line showing here is where they are not. So this is where the purple, dark purple, blue is where they used to be. Up above here to the north, they are no longer found in these places, but here to the south is where they currently reside. So then Jeff and Scott and John wanted to know about the birds, say, in this part of North Carolina. What are they doing here? And so they visited places where they were known to be in the past, and then did surveys and playback work to see are they still there. And the red is where they found birds, and this is the sandhill down here. So they're still finding a lot of Bachman sparrows in the red, but there are places in the sandhills where they didn't find them, where they apparently are extirpated. Brunswick County, where most of them are extirpated, all of Henslow County, all the historic sites are now vacant. There are no Bachman sparrows here. Here over in Carteret, this is the Croatan National Forest. They still manage for longleaf pine, and you get Bachman sparrow. So if you want to see one, a good place to go is like Weymouth Woods or the Sandhills Game Land. You can go to Croatan or Holly Shelter and go in the spring when they're singing. It's a beautiful song. It's one of the other sparrows that I would recommend. Go online and listen to their song. It's really cool. It's a plain-breasted sparrow. And again, the back, to me, that's really diagnostic. Here's a bird that's got this reddish-brown or rufous coloration and then gray streaking with it. So that's different from a lot of the other ones. A proportionally long tail. And it's one of the birds that has somewhat big bill, not quite big like a grasshopper, but it's a little bit bigger than your, by proportion than some of the others. It's a ground forager. It will sing in the subcanopy. You find them by their song. But when you start to sneak up on them, they tend to drop to the ground and run. They will not fly very far. They just drop straight down and run. The ground nester. And so again, you're going to look for them by their geography and their habitat. I used to play this song, but I don't think I'm not set up to make it work right now. But you can go online and hear the song. It's pretty cool. And then this is another enigmatic bird, kind of like the larkspur, where some birds showed up in North Carolina and stayed. And it's sort of odd because I don't think we don't really understand the history. But here's a case where I said where the pattern on the back, where it's rufous and black, it's different from that grasshopper sparrow that I showed you before. This is a small sparrow like the grasshopper, and but it's called Henslow sparrow. And Emily did some recent research, and so I wanted to describe some of that for you. But the first thing, you just notice that even though this is an out of focus picture, that olive color around the head, it's really diagnostic on a Henslow sparrow. if it's not hit, if the light's not too bright on it. It's really pretty. The streaking, a little bit of spotting on the breast. It's just faint. It does have a proportionally large bill and a long tail. So here's a shot that Jeff got recently down in the sandhills. Again, you see that olivey colored head and a real distinctive streaking on the upper breast. It's a rare breeder in the shrub scrub, but mostly in the wet meadows. And it currently only breeds at a former Voice of America site in Pitt County. We find them in some shrub scrub, but they don't stay but more than a year or two. It's not their preferred habitat. Their preferred is these wet meadows, which is what you get. And there's a large subsection that's managed by the Wildlife Resources Commission. So again, if you only saw the head of this bird, you would know what it is. And so here's what I mean. The bird normally occurs here in the Midwest, north of here, upper Midwest, up into Pennsylvania, that sort of Great Lakes region. Then they migrate down here for the winter. And yet we have this weird population down here that took up residence, and they breed there every year. It's in these wet meadows, very few saplings. They then move into longleaf pine during the winter, which we don't quite understand, and we don't really understand the extent of that, but we know that's what they do. So here's Emily, and she did her research recently looking at these birds at the VOA site. One thing she did was go and search 80 other North Carolina sites with good habitat. There were no Henslow sparrows. So the VOA game lands have more than the old radio site. So the VOA site is divided into two sites. One is game land and one is the old radio site. And the commission manages the game land. I believe the radio site is managed by Beaufort County. And she thinks this is due to the difference in how they manage it. So the game land burns, the radio mows. So it appears that burning is better for what the birds like, better for the vegetation, and the birds like it better. So in 2024, she estimates that there were 400 plus singing males. And she put some tracking tags on birds and used a system that automatically recorded locations, like a barcode reader for birds. She put all these little boxes out across those meadows, hundreds of them. And when the birds move around, they send a signal. It's picked up by these boxes, and then it's sent to a central computer. And I'm actually going to come back to this when I talk about some work that other students did down on the coast with marsh sparrows. But it's a pretty fascinating way to get data. So these birds require these large contiguous grasslands, which with just a few stems, they don't like to have too many little saplings out in the meadow. They're very picky that way. There's a couple of close-ups. Here's one wearing one of the tags that she used for the local movement of a bird. So this thing is always sending a signal every minute, sends a signal, or if the bird is flying by one of the boxes, and the box can be put out in any array you want. She probably had them at like every 100 meters or so, and birds are constantly getting picked up, getting signals picked up. So she had tons of data. The thing she figured out that when they're breeding, a pair of birds will use about 2.5 hectares, which is about 6 acres. She found the nest success was very high at that game land site, and that they only nest within about a 2-acre patch of grass. So they might be using 6 acres, but the areas where they would build a nest, there was a certain type of grass patchiness, and they would so again, very picky about where they put their nest. It's on the ground. They nest on the ground. A lot of these sparrows are on the ground or almost on the ground. They were fledging 3.5 chicks per nest. That's pretty good fledging. And 80% of birds that they recaptured in subsequent years were recaptured within 200 meters of their first capture. So that's like coming home, really home. And it seems that the game land site numbers are actually increasing. So that's good news. So I'm going to switch to the marsh sparrows, where a couple of students that I know did their graduate work on. There are 3 kinds of marsh sparrow down on the coast. I'm just going to go through the pictures of them and show you some of their results. So the Nelson sparrow, type of marsh sparrow, again, a pretty diagnostic head pattern where it's got this ochre color, the gray, and then this dark chestnut color. There's different subspecies. These are just showing you some specimens we have, and You can see where there's been handwriting. People who study them come in and make determinations about subspecies. So here's a couple of examples where Evan has birds in the hand, but again, that's a pretty diagnostic head pattern. And so here's where they are. They're breeding up here, and then in Canada, mostly upper U.S., like in North Dakota, South Dakota, they migrate through. And then there's some breeding population here, Hudson Bay, and some breeding birds over in northeast side of Canada, and then they come down. There's some breeding birds here in New England too, and then they come down our coast. So where they're generally found is on the coast. And so where Evan and Murray are doing their work is down here in New Hanover County, and a little bit in Brunswick County. So if you want to see a Nelson's or a salt marsh or a seaside sparrow, you go to the coast. So here's the salt marsh sparrow. And the bill's a little bit bigger by proportion, and the pattern on the head is a little bit different. It's similar to the Nelson's for sure, but here they are. It's a little bit different. And here's one of those tags again, like Emily had. It's what we call a cellular tracking technology tag. So Evan and Murray were doing the work. And again, a bird that's just wintering here on the coast, and it has a very limited breeding up here. And people up here study them, and then people down here study them, and folks are in a network of those who study marsh sparrows. So if you want to go and find these birds, go to Fort Fisher, because you can see salt marsh and Nelson's down here at Fort Fisher. And you might find seaside as well. Again, some specimens just to show that people look at these things and study them and make determinations about the subspecies. Some of the folks at UNC Wilmington were doing that to understand which is which. This is the seaside sparrow. It's a little bit larger and it's much grayer, as you can see. I don't think that's difficult to see by any stretch. So there's a bird in the reeds, and you can tell it's a really gray bird. It does have this yellow patch in the eye, and the bill stands out. You'll know it if you see one of these. And here's some in the hand, again with a CTT tag. So these birds, apparently there's some migration. We get them all year round or down on the coast. We get some that breed here and then they leave, but some stay. And it's a saltwater marsh bird, but so is the salt marsh sparrow. And so what? Again, it's a coastal bird. So the three species, some with subspecies, and Evan and Murray were trying to figure out more of what's going on. So that's what they were looking at, was looking at the winter population biology of salt marsh Nelsons and seaside sparrows in southeastern North Carolina. One of the ways they do things, again, there's a CTT tag and there's a thing called a MODIS tag, the MODIS tower. And I just mentioned that because that's more for migration. That's a Latin word for movement. Here we are putting up a tower. We went down to help them put up. Murray and Evan here are experts at putting up these towers that run by solar. This is over at the off Sunset Beach at the Rachel Carson Preserve. These antennas are tuned to one frequency. There are two antennas. There'll be two frequencies you can deploy to pick up birds that are migrating. So those are birds moving long distances. And here's where the tower locations are across Canada, the US, Mexico, South America. This is a system developed by people in Northeast Canada. And it's really become very popular. If a bird is tagged in North Carolina and migrates across the Gulf into the Yucatan, the towers here are going to pick up that signal. And that signal gets sent back to a central computer, and then you can see where your bird has been or where it's going. The CTT, as I said before, is more like a barcode reader, and that's more for local daily movement. So you go deploy your boxes all around an area like this marsh area, and you have them in an array such that the bird flying through here, if it's got a tag on, it's going to be getting picked up by all these boxes, all these readers. And every minute there's some signal going. So it's a lot of data. And what does a lot of data look like? Well, here's one bird in 1 month, one seaside sparrow. So you can see that this bird spent time here, but then it also spent time down here, and then it went over here across the canal over to this side. Here's a salt marsh sparrow, in the same area, but it did not move as much as the seaside sparrow. So these are little tidbits about their biology and that we want to get at to understand how these birds make a living, how they do what they do. And this is what Emily did with her Henslow sparrows as well up at the VOA site. Pretty interesting. You can take those data and you can ask the computer to turn it into something like, hey, where's the bird spending like 50% of its time and where is it spending 100%? And that's what these show. So here's a Nelson sparrow, here's a salt marsh sparrow, here's a seaside sparrow, and the darker blue, purple is the 50%, and the paler lilac is where computers telling you the bird spent the rest of its time. So it gives you an idea of how the birds are using the habitats and using the landscape. So that we're going to wind up on a few birds. This one is just a beautiful bird that's a far northern breeder, then migrates into our area. We see them starting in mid-November. Then there's the spring migration where we'll see them again in February, March as they head north. They got a long way to go. But I think many of you probably know a fox sparrow, but this is where its name comes from. Thinking like a red fox. It's a beautiful, beautiful chestnutty color with the gray on it. Unmistakable. The tail is all chestnut or reddish brown, as you will. Here's a comparison with a song sparrow. Here's this guy's got the central spot and mustache, but you can tell, you would know a fox sparrow. And this fox sparrow is probably the largest sparrow that we see in our area. Here's one that showed up in my backyard. Every now and then they do that. I've only seen this happen twice in 20 years, but during some really bad weather, through my dirty kitchen window, it's still unmistakable that this is a fox sparrow. And then this is a shot that my friend Keith Kennedy got up in North Raleigh a few years ago. A beautiful bird. Swamp sparrows, a smaller bird. You can see by my hand here holding this guy. What sets this guy apart is again this pattern on this is the wing pattern, this chestnut color again. So as I said, there's 50 shades of reddish brown, but this is pretty much in just this part of the bird, especially right here, pretty diagnostic. I'll show you a few different images because there is a bit of variation, but the gray face is often a part of these birds. In the fall, winter, the crown is streaked. It's chestnut in the spring. I'll show you one. It's like a chipping sparrow in the spring, but in the fall, winter, it's a streaked black with the chestnut. But that chestnut, what we call the shoulder area, is really diagnostic. Just a couple of birds that are younger. Again, you can see the head's not chestnut really. It's the streakiness, even the front streaky, but this reddish brown is showing up here in the wings. This one's more reddish brown. This is really more typical. You see one from the side. Another angle, and again, light hitting it, but that's part of the wing where that reddish brown or chestnut, rufous, whatever you want to call it, it really stands out on these guys. And yet another one. So here is one that's an adult. So this is what I mean when they molt in the spring before they leave, because they hang around till April in North Carolina before they head north. They get this chestnut cap the way a chipping sparrow might, but this bird has this gray line over the eyes. And it's in these habitats that are usually a little bit wet or weedy, shrubby, scrubby fields and such. They're not anywhere near where a chipping sparrow hangs out. And here's a real bold chestnut. This is the bird we caught in late April. It was really molted in, ready to go. My colleague did interesting studies at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. There's a population of swamp sparrows that breed in the Delmarva region, that Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, and they're different. They're considered a different subspecies. And what Russ and his colleagues wanted to know is where they go in the winter, because nobody knew. And then about 20 years ago or so, I guess it was 20 or so, they analyzed some feathers from the head, and you can look at isotope ratios, carbon and nitrogen isotopic ratios, which are it's a signal that's in the bird's feathers because it's depending on what they eat, and what they eat is insects and seeds, which is picked up from the areas that where the feather grows, and and that isotopic signature is distinctive across the U.S., across the world, really. So by latitude and longitude. So what they figured out was, well, they're molting in the spring before they return to the Delmarva. They're growing in these new feathers, so they could get head feathers. They would know where the feathers grew based on this isotopic signature, and they figured out that they are wintering in an area that goes from about Beaufort, North Carolina, to Charleston, South Carolina. So I thought that was a pretty neat little study. And then they came to North Carolina, asked us to go out with them and help net some birds just to see in the hand if they were in fact matched what they thought, and they did. So it's a widespread bird. Here's another one that's breeding mostly to the north. Some of them come down the Alleghanies and again in the Delmarva, but it's not a North Carolina breeder, but it's a common fall winter bird of North Carolina. I just wanted to show you occurrence graph because this is what we do with our band data and what Brian does with his survey data. This is stuff from Prairie Ridge. These years are combo Prairie Ridge Uwharrie data, and these are just Uwharrie's data. And the 2 points here are that the orange is October, and then alongside that November. So we're seeing these pulses in October, November when the birds show up, and that's pretty typical. But then what we also see in some of the cases is here, this darker color on the right-hand side of these years, like this one here, that's March and April. That one's April. This is right here, March, April. So what's happening is these birds they migrate in October, November. A lot of them keep going. So this number here, this graph part here in December. So the numbers are lower because they stay all winter, but then in the spring, they're coming back through the Piedmont. Not all the birds come back through the same area when they migrate north. They often show a different trajectory when they're migrating between the spring and the fall. But in this case, the birds are coming through in the fall, and then they come back through in the spring. And so we see that when we plot out the data. And I mentioned banding a lot, and maybe not everybody knows. I think most do, but to do that, to catch the bird, we deploy these nets. These are the young women I mentioned before that helped me a lot. They set up this project in 2015 when they were in high school, and here they are taking birds out of the net, and here they are processing some of them. We still communicate. We're working on data together. They've been a big help, and then the crew grew over time, so it's gotten bigger and bigger. There's my colleague Gabriella with the Wildlife Resources Commission. She's also the pollinator person in North Carolina for the commission, is running that North Carolina Bumblebee Atlas project. But she's also a really good bird bander. She was a junior curator at the museum years ago. I won't say how many years, but it was a few years. And Keith has been helping me out for a long time with the data. So anyway, I've gotten a lot of help with stuff over the years. So here, the last two sparrows that we have, I think these are the last two, one that are pretty common around here. One is a song sparrow, and then the last is white-throated. A lot of people know the song sparrow. It's another one with reddish-brown, but it's sort of reddish-brown all over. Wing in the back, even on the head, tail. Some of the birds are a little bit browner because we have a couple of subspecies that come through in the fall and the winter. Often has a central breast spot, but not always. This bird does not really have it, but the streaking is here. And then this mustache is pretty diagnostic. Just this guy and the Savannah are the only ones that really show this mustache. So here's a bird out my dirty kitchen window again, just to show you that I'm not seeing the whole bird, but I'm seeing enough. I can see the mustache, I see the spot, and there's no self-respecting Savannah sparrow that would perch in my shrubs in my backyard. That's just not the right habitat. So I know just from seeing this that this is a song sparrow. It's a widespread bird. There are birds that breed all over, but interestingly enough, it's less common in a lot of the Piedmont areas. And when it breeds in the Piedmont, it's more in very urban places. For example, they don't really breed at Prairie Ridge, maybe one or two pairs. They don't breed at our Uwharrie site out here in Randolph County, even though, but if you go into town, into Asheboro, they probably breed. They like these box hedges and other things like that. So here it is a northern breeder, but in the purple is where they're found all year round. And so in North Carolina, we get both birds that come down. Again, we get a couple of subspecies, but it's in pretty much every county. And again, just to show you the pattern of data we get from our bird banding data. So again, Prairie Ridge, and Uwharries. I didn't sort them out by like effort and number of nets and all, but just the pattern shows. So here's the Uwharries. And again, October, November is when they show up. Numbers drop off because they spend the winter. But here, we don't see anything in the spring. We don't see them coming back through in March and April. We just hardly catch. So they're whatever migration they're doing through North Carolina, it's not where we're working at Prairie Ridge or the Uwharrie, not in the Piedmont. Maybe they go to the east along the coast. Maybe they go west along the escarpment. I don't know. Nobody knows yet, but it's not where we're working. So again, it's the kind of pattern we're interested in seeing. Also, just noting that in our case, we know from our data that when I say October, November, these birds show up between mid-October and mid-November. It's very precise movements through our area. Early October, we catch some, but not very many. It's after the 15th when they really show up. All right, so what does Brian find similar to doing survey work? We like to compare what we catch versus what he detects on his surveys. They show up in mid-September, but they really peak in mid-November. That's pretty much what we found. And then they decrease from early December into February. They're gone by April. That's what we see. And there's only a few pairs that breed out there, even though you can find them over on NC State campus breeding, but you don't find them at Prairie Ridge. And then the white-throated sparrow, one of the favorite sparrows, really, of most of us. It's common, it's everywhere, and it's really pretty cool looking bird, especially this version. There are two flavors, I call it. These are the black and white ones, and they often have that yellow on the head. So they're the beautiful one that my colleague Bob Oberfelder got. So it's what we call a polymorphic species because there's a tan form and a white form, and it's maintained in a 50-50 percentage in nature. It's a chromosome thing going on as well as behavior. And the forms can be either male or female. So what we call the bird of four sexes, because you can be a tan male, tan female, you can be a white male or a white female. The adults almost always mate with the opposite color morph. It turns out that the white males are a little more aggressive, but there's more to it. So here's a tan one, a little more tan. The white males are more aggressive. They sing a little bit more. They can sing a little prettier, depending on how you define that. White striped females might even do some singing. The tan striped females do not sing, and the males just don't sing as well. But the tan striped adults tend to feed their young more often, so they are better at parental care. So if you're a white-throated sparrow female, you got choices to make, and that's pretty, a bit challenging because you can have either Mr. Right or Mr. Right now. So if you've got a white form male, that's the songster, but he's not going to help you with the kids very much. Whereas the tan one may not be as pretty. It's going to help you around the house more. So this is a young one. They're pretty drab, often show the streaking underneath. And again, this is what we call the sparrow with four sexes because of that polymorphism and how it's maintained in nature and the behavioral differences. Elena Tuttle did the original work years ago. She spent about 25 years looking at the behavior in New York and then documented the genetics. So they have this chromosomal arrangement where these behavioral traits in the crown color are inherited as like a super gene. And so I was curious about looking at the sexes of these sparrow, the white-throated and the song sparrow, just to know what do we got, because you can't tell them apart when they're in the hand or anything. Unless they're singing, you don't know if it's a male or female. And then, of course, in the winter, they're not singing. So I got Ashley Lamb when she was in high school. This was before the pandemic, to learn how to take blood from birds. So here she is bleeding a sparrow, and the other kids are fascinated by that. And we put them in vials, and then Marianne Barrier is our genomics lab director, and she's willing to work with students and train them on the equipment to do the, the chromosome or DNA analysis. And so Ashley got pretty far along, and then we had about 75 samples of both across the white-throated and song sparrow, and she got them all purified, was ready to do analysis. The pandemic hit. She, grew up, went to college and all that, but she got her younger sister involved. So now Molly Kate has been learning the technique, taking all the samples, getting them run through the gels here in the lab. And here's some of the early data we're getting. So in birds, the females have a double, they have what we would call XY. It's not called XY in birds, but you get the point. So it's different from mammals. So, and the males are with the same. So anyway, the female will show two bands on a graph. The male show one. And so Molly Kate just now getting some results. And so we'll see. I was just curious if out of a random sample, but we could also do that sample at different times of the year to see who's out on the landscape. Do the percentages change? You could also do it. You could fine tune it by different microhabitats. There's an indication that there's some sexual segregation by some of the sparrows by habitat. So a male, for example, swamp sparrow likes a certain microhabitat where the female swamp sparrow likes it slightly different. So that would be pretty detailed work that anybody could do. But one of the ways you would know is by getting the blood and doing the assay. So white-throated sparrows are everywhere, and that's one of the things we love about them. So again, another northern breeder migrates down, and here they are. Again, a pattern similar to it's kind of a combo of swamp and song sparrow where we get these pulses in the fall here again. So here again we've got orange and tan is October, November. Actually, as Brian indicated, they in his survey they show up more in November. So here we're seeing more peaks in November. They come a little later than a song sparrows. They come through, but then you see this peak again in March. So that's a case where they're migrating back through the Piedmont in the spring, similar to a swamp sparrow. So in this case, it's a pattern that we document by being able to catch them, and Brian has seen that when he does his surveys here. So they show up in increase from mid-October to mid-November, decrease about 50% because most of them are migrating through, and then some stay for the winter. But then another big increase in the late winter, early spring when they're migrating back through. And so it's an urban bird, as well as a forest bird, as well as a meadow bird. It's a very, very adaptable little guy, and we love having him around. They're in my backyard. One of the things I tried one time just to a little experiment was I brought those kids over to the backyard in December of 2018, and we were banning birds. I was training, and I decided we'd ban 5 of these white throats. And then with digital photography now, I can get good enough photos to actually read the numbers on these things. So even if it is through a dirty window, I can still read that number. I can tell you that it's 02418 on this guy, and this was 3 years later. And then this guy was March of 2021, different number. But this guy was 2022. And so I thought it was pretty cool that here we were like 3.5, 4 years later, and they're still coming back to my little backyard. They just really tied to their sense of space. But we see that with all of our band data. A lot of these birds show up the next year and be caught in almost the same net, whether it's at Prairie Ridge or the Uwaris. They're really, really tied to a sense of place. And then there's some oddballs that I've gotten photos of. So here's a really fun one. It's a true albino, as we call it. It's got the pink eye. It's got no pigment here in the bill. And this looks like a white-throated sparrow to me. And based on what the people told me. More often what we see are birds with white feathering. So this is a junco. This is a white-throated sparrow at Prairie Ridge right now. Little yellow in the head here like they have. And then here's another what looks like a white-throated sparrow. I think this is probably another white-throated sparrow up here. They didn't get any other photos of that one. And then this guy, here's another shot of it here. You can see the yellow face of a white-throated sparrow. And so that's I'm ending with that. And Chris, I am going to. Do you want me to stop sharing?
Yeah, that'll be fine. Thank you, John.
All right.
Wild stuff. The diversity of this like just one group of birds is kind of mind-boggling.
It really is.
It's also mind-boggling that anybody could remember all of the subtleties in those facial patterns and wing bars, and that, 1 millimeter of a wingtip is black and the other millimeter of a wingtip is brown, and that's how you tell the difference.
I know. I got to get out more.
So, we'll take just a moment or two for some questions. One that came in, and I had this question as well, was there was a bird, its scientific name was sandwichensis,
Yeah.
and that is to me a curious species name.
There is, a Sandwich Island. There was the name of somebody, Sandwich, and I would have to look that one up, but I'm guessing that it's based on a location. I know I know in I want to say it's northern South America is where there's a Sandwich Island. So, yeah, and it
Nice.
doesn't have anything to do with the food. Yeah,
Nobody put a sparrow on a sandwich and
no,
thought, great,
no, right,
let's
no.
So another thing, there were several examples, several sparrows that you said there aren't necessarily historical records for them in North Carolina, but they're starting to show up in certain habitats or microhabitats around the state. Why do you think that is?
Um, ooh, do you remember what that was? I would
There were some that were, I think, popping up at like your Uwharrie site, some that popped up at Prairie Ridge, and then some at the coast.
that weren't there before. I might have misspoken.
Or
Um,
that or I might be misunderstanding it too, but that that really only show up in really small locations and then they're not seen anywhere else.
oh well, there's right, right. No, so there's the Henslow sparrow and the lark sparrow. They just show up in these two little spots, and we don't know why. I mean, we know that the lark sparrow likes a savanna type habitat, which is you get that in a longleaf, but they're not in the longleaf per se. They get out into where the artillery is deploy deployed because the fires that show from the artillery that keeps the vegetation way low, and even the ground is half sand soil, and and then the Henslows is maintained because the Voice of America site was burned and mowed, so it's sort of artificial. How they got there, it just goes to show birds move around, but what made it to where you could get a male and a female stay and breed, and then in a case like the Henslows, they now 400 singing males, um, and they just grew and grew. There had to be more than just a couple of birds that showed up. So was that like a storm that blew them off? Uh, Sometimes you get one or two birds leading the flock of birds, and they show up, and then for whatever reason they stayed. Those are the two that uh, we're not sure why. You know, especially larkspur, it just shouldn't be here. And at least Henslows, there are some birds to the north that are in the east, but the larkspur is a western, more west of here, so that makes no sense. Yeah,
Yeah, interesting stuff.
yeah.
All right, another one from the chat for you. Do sparrows generally show a lot of color difference between males and females?
No, which is why we were doing the chromosome thing because you just cannot. I cannot tell you a male, female of any of them unless the male is singing. But in the winter, nobody's singing. So when I'm holding and banding these sparrows, which are, mostly the song and whitethroat that we catch a lot of, I don't know who they are, and I'm curious. So people, when you're in the breeding, if you're studying the breeding birds, then you can see who's singing. You can then tag them. So I tagged a few song sparrows in my yard years ago, and because they were breeding, you can also tell the females when they have this thing called a brood patch because that's what incubates they lose feathers on their belly, and that increases the heat to the eggs. So only the female sparrow do that. And So when I caught these birds, I knew the male from the female, and I put specific colored rings on their feet, and I could tell from then on who was who. I didn't have to hear them, I didn't have to hold them again, but not everybody can do that. But up north, if you're studying them where they're breeding, you can do that. Otherwise, we don't know. So that's why we were trying to do this chromosome thing just to see, is there more than one versus the other? Is it 50-50? Um, and then ultimately you could do that like in every month of the year to see if the proportion changes during the winter. Um,
Excellent stuff.
I will say this, one last thing. The
Yeah.
birds can see in the UV. That's the fourth dimension, so to speak, which we cannot. And so it's very, very likely that in addition to their male singing, that they look different to each other, but in the UV. And I know people have been doing that kind of work because you can measure them with this little UV reader and convert it to a color on your computer, and so you can see. And I don't know for sparrows who's been doing that. I just haven't kept up with that literature. But we do know that um, to a lot of birds that look alike to us, the males and females are different in the UV. So
Oh, wow. That's pretty cool.
yeah, you need your Superman eyes.
You will have to come down to the collection one day and just walk up and down the aisles with some black lights and see what we
Right.
get. Well, John, thanks so much for doing this. Thanks for sharing with us all of your knowledge, all those amazing photographs that you've collected too, and opening up the world of the sparrow to us.
No problem. And I think people know my email, so if they have questions, they can, send me an email. Went a little longer than I wanted, so they didn't get to all the questions, I'm sure, but they can send me an email and we'll get to them. So,
Sounds great. Well, John, thanks for being with us today. Thanks to all of the viewers for tuning in, checking out today's program. We won't be here next Wednesday because of the holiday, but we will be back here in the month of December on December 4th with another great presentation for you. I think they put it in the chat. We're talking about the magnificent ram's horn snail on Wednesday, December 4th. Remember, you can join us here on the museum's YouTube channel, or you can come into the SCCU Daily Planet Theater to check out the program as well. We'll be in person and virtual, always hybrid. So thanks for joining with us, everybody. We will see you again next time. Take care, folks. Bye.